what I want to do today is to focus on leadership again. Hello, Marianne. I want to focus on leadership again because I think it is just so important. And one could say, well, you've talked about that before. But John, who's my leadership guru, I wouldn't be able to say anything about leadership if I hadn't been working with him for 2 years now. And I do feel that this is important. And after all, that's what we stand for in 4SD. So we thought we should continue to just explore what are the aspects of leadership that are so important right now. And my reasoning has a starting point, and that is that we really do need to be absolutely clear that we are leading for a combination of equity and justice within the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda, or whatever other code that we're using with our emphasis on equity. And it's all equity in all areas. We're not here confining it to any particular aspect. So, and everybody knows that one of our areas of focus is on, for example, gender inequity, but also we're worried about inequity in relation to access to care and to services and to opportunity. And we're increasingly focused also on equity in relation to nature. You know, there is a very important role for natural systems in our current lives and then in the future. And that's absolutely on the basis of all the work that we've done over the last few years on nature-based solutions for employment, for climate, and for secure futures for all. And so I thought that perhaps a starting statement might be that listening to all voices is the only way to reach equity and justice for all people and for the planet. And I suppose I'd go further than that and say, listening to all voices and then acting on what we've heard is the only way to reach equity and justice for all people and the planet. And then leading off from that, I thought that to just give a few remarks about the leadership challenge. You know, we are, all of us, in the midst of some rather complex and interconnected issues that have to be tackled. It's not an option, despite the uncertainty about what are the best pathways to move forward. And experiences from around the world reinforce the importance of informed and enlightened leadership. And the characteristic of that leadership is to enable people to make sense of the evolving situations in which they find themselves, and then to make choices that balance risk and need. And it's that notion that at the heart of this is the opportunity for everybody to be able to make choices and to work out for themselves what level of risk they're prepared to take in the light of the needs they face, that I believe is the ultimate goal that we seek to attain. And just in parentheses, I've never been one of these people who says that in public health, we've got to achieve certain targets for reduction in maternal mortality, or reduction in child mortality, or improvements in child nutrition. I can understand why people want to use those targets, but for me, our role is to enable people to be able to be in a position to choose whether or not they want to attain good nutrition for their families, or whether they want to be able to do everything possible to reduce the risk of suffering during childbirth. Because it's that opportunity to choose and to be able to make one's own sense of the situation and the risk, as well as the need of the individual and the household and the community. It's that luxury of choice that I think more and more is, for me at least, the purpose of my work in public health and development. And so if we're trying to help people get to that point, what do we spend our time doing? we accompany different actors as they take action after they've been listening and then trying to work out what best to do. Because it's often quite a lonely process working with systems, and working particularly with living systems, with people in the center of the systems, because there's no clear pathway. Nobody is saying, that's the journey, or this is the way you do it. And so this notion of being able to accompany each other through often really challenging complexity with extraordinary uncertainty, because you just don't know what's going on, is really, really important. And that's what we're doing in our 4ST group. And I think what many of our colleagues in the World Health Organization or in national governments, it's what we're all doing with each other. We're accompanying each other as we try to make sense of what is happening. We accompany each other as we know we're taking decisions that lead to results, and we're not quite sure what those results are going to be. And so this role of accompanying is so important. And it's so much of it is not simply giving out guidance in a sort of firm, authoritarian way. You should stay 2 meters apart from each other, or you must be wearing masks all the time. I mean, that's not the way it works, because all the time people are having to make choices, and all the time those choices require balancing, as I said, risk and need in a very skillful way. And that's why the accompanying function is so important. And so, okay, we're accompanying, but then what's at the heart of the work that one has to do in systems leadership? It's about bringing people together. Bringing together people who've often got very different perspectives on what they want to do. Bringing together people who actually really don't like each other because they've been involved in various conflicts over whose interests should prevail. But our job in systems leadership is to create a cradle in which coming together feels good, even if we really don't like each other, but it feels good. And in that cradle, connections happen. And when those connections happen, there is an opportunity for exploring different ways of doing things. And I'm sure many of you are saying, well, that's a bit idealistic. You know, if people really don't like each other, they're not going to get into this phase of exploring and actually connecting inside themselves with their feelings and their emotions that's so necessary. But we've seen, honestly, over, I think, large parts of our professional lives, that it does happen. And it's not idealism, that people can feel their way to different ways of looking at issues, often in a quite a surprising manner. And so that's our accompaniment function, helping to create the cradles, within the cradles watching connections develop, and then seeing how those connections can become really quite unusual and surprising as the individuals inside the cradles can just shift away from long-held positions and explore and experiment and feel good about it. And so all that is great. Okay, so you make the cradles and new connections happen and opportunities emerge, but so what? And then we come back to the point of it all. And that is that we do want to make certain that equity and justice and dignity are able to be features of the evolving reality of the human existence, because we continue to believe that there is this potential inside all of us and inside all of our groups for just doing so much better than we seem to be doing on a number of really tricky issues. Obviously, it's public health, because that's the subject. But then it's equity and rights. And particularly it's about women and trying to just address the extraordinary disparities and the opportunities for women and men, and to stop the systematic suppression of women and denial of rights, whether it's in sex and sexual and reproductive health, or opportunity, or remuneration. That's so important. And then on from that, obviously, is income equity, access to health services, and all the rest, as I said. And then getting into the really existential and giant challenges of nature, of climate, and generally of securing a world that really is going to be good, not just for our children and our grandchildren, but for the generations still to come. And I think in terms of 7 generations, because I was taught to do so by Indigenous people who said, that's the life, that's the time scale that you really need to be thinking about, because that's where we have to go. And so getting there requires a leadership approach. And I thought I'd just finish these opening remarks by giving a few words about it. People-centered and leaving no one behind. Universal, based on values, rather than selective, based on the interests of countries or tribal groups. Interconnected, because that's what life is. It's not broken up into silos, however much we might want to, in our universities, in our NGOs, or in our governments. And then integrated in terms of how we work, because when we work together, we're so much better than divided up. And having a spirit of partnering all the time. That doesn't mean partnerships, but it means partnering, coming together, working together. And so that's the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which for me, after it was agreed in 2015, following 3 years of negotiation, is the plan that we have that was agreed by all world leaders. And for me, that is still my overarching big horizon, and the one to which I believe many of those with whom I'm working, many of the people who've been with us in 4SD over the years, that's what really matters. And so the starting point when we come back to COVID is this. COVID is the great revealer. It reveals interdependence, but it also reveals fragility and inequity. And we've discussed that on these briefings, and we just hold that. That's the starting point. Secondly, everything comes connected: health, finance, cohesion of society, and it's all within power structures, and that is a reality, and we have to accept that. And that's why COVID sort of uncovers the way in which the power structures really affect the capacity of people to avoid sickness and to be strong and to be resilient. And it shows issues around wealth, gender, race, and climate. And it's saying to us, come on, get real. You want to get on top of this disease, you've got to address the other systemic inequities and the power structures that reinforce them and rigidify them. And that's what systems leadership is. It's a softening force, especially when we do the living systems leadership, which is the focus on the people in systems, because of this fundamental belief that people intrinsically have the capacity to do it differently. And so folks say to me, well, David, you've said all that, and that sounds right. And it's a bit like going to church and you come out afterwards and say, yeah, okay, we're going to be better. But then you get straight out and you find that actually the same anger and frustrations and protestations and pontifications are still there. Such a mess. And so I'm saying, well, yeah, actually, mess is always going to be there. That's the whole point about working with these kinds of systems. It's a facet of life. And it often feels totally overwhelming how on earth am I going to find a way out of this mess? And you feel, you get up in the morning and you feel stuck and helpless sometimes. And so can we give it sort of 3 or 4 suggestions before we go into the discussion? I'm looking at the clock, by the way, 4 minutes. First of all, do the things you can. Don't do the things that you can't. Simple, isn't it? Do what you can do. But gosh, it's good advice. Because if you do things that you can, then at least you can make stuff happen. If there are things that you absolutely can't do, you shouldn't try to do them, because you'll feel terrible and you get no result. So I think this business of focusing on the stuff you can do is quite helpful. Even if you sometimes think, oh, well, it's tiny, it's not going to make a difference. You just don't know. Unless you start out, you don't know what's going to happen. So focus on trying to make a difference and seek to avoid paralysis. And then connect. You know, some people ask, well, you keep going on about connecting. Why? And I say, it's through connections that you find new opportunities. You open new doors. You see new possibilities. And it's wonderful. The longer you go on connecting and finding and exploring, the more joy there is, because so many possibilities emerge. And I don't think this is just me talking from a position of privilege. I've seen it in so many different locations, that those who connect are those who find new and possible pathways. You meet people, you learn from them, you share with them, you love them, they love you. And suddenly you find really strong and amazing relationships building up. The human connection, it matters so much. Connecting with our hearts and our souls as well as with our heads. So that's much harder on Zoom, isn't it? But I'm trying to learn ways of doing it, and I hope you'll feedback if you think it works. Because it's then, with that power of relationships and that opportunity of opening new possibilities, that suddenly you can reach beyond what for you is the normal. You can find new ways to go and new opportunities. When you change your relationship with the problem itself changes. It just looks different and feels different. And I found that on so many issues: health issues, food issues, water and sanitation issues, equity issues, employment issues. When you change your relationship with a problem, the problem itself changes. In subsequent online briefings, I want to go further with this. I want to explore with you more about how this form of leadership can actually offer real exciting opportunities, not just for us who are probably quite into it anyway, but for others, and how sharing what we believe to be the power of living systems working can actually be very enlightening for many different people. And you can't predict in advance who's going to find it, helps them and turns them on. It really is something that everybody has to work through for themselves. So one other thing is, while we go into the question and answer and opportunities for people to speak and reflect on what's being said, I wanted to just add that this time I've got so many what I call snippets of news from around the world about what's happening on COVID. Some incredibly inspiring, like I discussed last time, the amazing things happening in favelas in Brazil. Some quite disturbing, quite honestly, because whatever you might read in any of the papers that you've got, this virus is continuing across the world and causing extraordinary challenges as well. The containment efforts are causing challenges as well. And if you want to come up with any particular issues, or you want me to focus on any particular issues, I suddenly find I've got a huge lexicon of amazing snippets. But I'm going to go over to you, and Catherine is with me. Just thank you, Catherine, for this. And what's happening is that John and Twee and others in the team, Julian is there as well from the team, Magali from the team, they're looking at the chat and they're looking at who's on the Zoom. And what they're doing is they're feeding to Catherine what they're picking up, especially if there are those of you who say that you want to say a few words, and then they're passing me what they're seeing, and then I then see this, and also I look at you and bring you in. And I'm going to ask members of the team towards the end not to be shy and to come in as well and to comment, because of the particular style of this one, with its focus not so much on the COVID itself, but on how we lead through the inequity and the suffering, but to find the pathway to the state that will be COVID ready and also ready to deal with other existential challenges. Zenda Ofir. Zenda, I'm looking for you, and there you are, I can see you. Zenda, do you want to speak, or would you like me to say the words that you've written down here?
Yes, let me just unmute myself and make myself more visible. I have two questions. Shall I raise the first one? Accompanying resonates very well with developmental evaluation, which is a way to evaluate that really focuses on making the whole process for stakeholders empowering and useful. So my question is whether that kind of evaluation coupled to research, how you build it in your experience, your advice in terms of developing enlightened leaders who are well informed, the role that each plays, the way you see it possibly being useful or not, the opposite perhaps from your experience. I just wanted to highlight the importance of recognizing that evaluation and research can go hand in hand in leadership, but it's often not well done, and therefore one really needs to think about how it can be best done.
Thank you, Zenda. Everybody, Zenda is one of the sort of remarkable evaluation practitioners in our world, because she says evaluation is such a powerful tool, but she's also, as I understand it, critical of the misuse of evaluation. And so I want to start by saying something that I know you'll agree with, Zenda, which is that learning is at the core of systems leadership. And it's not just learning in terms of writing articles, because when you're talking about living systems, you have to recognize that they become really very much centers of the build-up of knowledge. And there's a lot of cognition inside a living system. When people work together, they accumulate an awful lot of not just knowledge in terms of facts and figures, but a general appreciation of ways of doing things to get better results. And so for me, evaluation is the ultimate learning discipline. And it is a very, very powerful discipline. I'm using the word discipline on purpose, because there are times when we need rigorous ways of thinking and very well-tested means for examining hypotheses and then shifting our worldview. And so building in a continuous cycle of learning while doing, for me, is at the heart of the kind of leadership that I'm talking about, and I think it's also at the heart of accompanying processes of change. So let us say there are so many good features to evaluation, but let us also, I think, be precise that the evaluation techniques are often not used to their full benefit. And that's why what I'm trying to do is to bring together the discipline of evaluation and the discipline of living systems leadership. And in as much as it's possible to establish frameworks that enable that kind of juxtaposition to happen, I would like to see it happen. The only challenge I have, Zenda, and you know this, is that I'm not yet easily able to find the docking points for these two areas of thought and action. And I suppose then my final answer to your question is, it's got to be work in progress. Let's remember the power of evaluation. Let's find easier ways of communicating what we mean by living systems leadership, and see whether we can, through various examples, bring the two in. Now, Zenda, you had a second question, so come in with that.
Yes, it's about probably something controversial. The SDGs and yourself mentioned leaving no one behind. I feel that's often rhetoric, and it's unfair to expect of leaders, let's say at national level or any level, to really have that as a mantra when countries are particularly poor or societies are impoverished, economically poor, purely because it's more expensive, more difficult, and particularly difficult to make work and sustain if institutions are not functioning and the systems in a country are not operating well. So for me, it's a matter of perhaps nuancing expectations and statements around leaving no one behind. When you deal with a country like Democratic Republic of Congo, you cannot talk about leaving no one behind. You know, it's very obviously very different to when you work in a far more well-off country. So I was wondering if you have a perspective on I suppose rhetoric versus practicality when you let's say assess systems leadership from that kind of SDG lens.
Gosh, thank you. What a tough one. By the way, welcome to Shamim Talukdar from Dhaka in Bangladesh. I see your family behind you, I think. It's lovely that you were able to join. Thank you. And also, thank you, Shamim. Welcome to Paul Garner, to the River Mersey behind you. It's lovely that you're there. Welcome to Orkieda. Thank you for joining. It's great that you find time. Chris Langdon on Thinking the Unthinkable and many other great things. Thank you. Melissa Taylor, Laura Chiaffi. Just greeting everybody as they join and not trying to dodge your questions, Zenda. But when I was starting my reflections on systems leadership, and particularly living systems leadership, I found myself wanting to say that an ultimate characteristic of this form of leadership is that it's value-based and value-driven, which means that whenever a decision is made, there are certain values that the decision maker is expected to take into account. It doesn't mean that every decision goes down a particular line, but I think from an evaluative perspective, there are certain values that need to be taken into account when decisions are made. And so for me, leaving no one behind is an expression in a group of words, a catchphrase for inclusion and equity, but it's not an absolute prescription, because as you so correctly point out, just at the moment, there is not some mechanism through which we will be able to shift from the current inequities, as you were referring to with the Democratic Republic of Congo, to an equitable world where those who are disadvantaged are able to come up to the sort of opportunities that a person with advantage like myself have. So, I mean, I know that that was a tricky question you were throwing at me, and I know that you were, because I know that this is something that the exercise is you as well. You described it to me once when we met, and so let me just leave it hanging as that was a piece of language that was used to try to indicate a particular value system that has to be at the heart of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Do you accept that, or do you think I've been a bit wobbly in getting out of that?
No, I think that is fair, and the reference to values that underlie that's ideal for what we do is certainly appropriate. I do think that, and I must say, I do think as somebody who is called to assess sometimes, or to help accompany people who assess things like leadership, have to take seriously the principles or the values that underlie what is done. And sometimes performance has to be looked at in that context. And that is why it is actually important to be nuanced in quite explicit in contexts where this may be an ideal and not a reality. I just find that we sometimes need to think more deeply about what this means for leadership, their priorities, and especially for trade-offs that need to be made, because trade-offs bring one back to values, where trade-offs often mean choices between values and the importance of values in certain situations.
And so, and in this work that we're doing, Zenda, to try to look at the future of food through food systems dialogues all over the world, like you, we're finding that in the end, the discussion is about values, and that means connecting with our emotional selves. And I know that evaluators don't always find that easy to do. We had a remarkable discussion with Michael Patton on blue marble evaluation, which is very heavily centered on that way of working. So everybody, evaluation as a discipline is changing and is actually aligning with some of the things that we were talking about on living systems leadership. Zenda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Move on now, because Louisa Nofke, who's been on some of the 4SD programs and is a member of the 4SD network, wanted to come in and make a remark. Louisa, just I think rather you say it than me read your words.
Thanks, David. I didn't expect to be speaking, but fine. I said to me read what I wrote. That leaving no one behind, for me, I see it as a guiding principle. It's more of a mission statement. So in that, I do agree with the value-based approach more than a direct strategy. And to keep it in mind while we're building new systems, new leadership structures, that should be the underlying principle rather than taking the statement too literally. So I'm basically rephrasing what you said in your response, and I'm I think very grateful to hear that we're aligned.
So cool that we do sometimes take the words of one and then rephrase them and then pass them back, because in this way of working there is no absolute. We have to be able to take ideas in, circle them around between our heads and our hearts and our intuition, and then reflect them back, because we all have different perspectives on the same thing. So thank you, Louisa. And best, I hope all is going well with you in your work and in your life. I'm really grateful to you for sparing the time to join us.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. I just want to spend a couple of minutes now focusing on issues around older people and COVID. This then will create a bit of an opening for me to invite Joseph Batac, who's joining us from the Philippines, to make a couple of comments. So Joseph, in 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you to speak, but just globally, according to the World Health Organization, which I love, 25% of deaths associated with COVID have been in residential care facilities for older people, 25%. And in some countries, it's much greater than that, it's more than 50%. And so we have to bear in mind that firstly, older people are more vulnerable. So when they get infected, they tend to get super ill and die. Secondly, there's a particular feature of residential care that makes it an environment where the virus is easily transmitted. It's kind of like prisons, kind of like meat processing plants. Sorry for the comparisons there, but it's a reality. That these are places where COVID moves around. And actually, it's country by country, 53% of deaths in Switzerland in residential care, 49% of deaths in Sweden, 46% in Scotland, 25% in the USA. Probably a lot more people in residential care have died of COVID, but they haven't been tested. So we just have to hold on to this. And why? Because the facilities were not properly prepared. And it reveals that actually there's some quite difficult features of not just of residential care, but of care more generally for older people. So Joseph, could you give your conversations about older people and COVID, your comments, just 3 or 4 minutes starting now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Welcome, Joseph, welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon from Manila. About this leadership that you're talking about, my concern is actually who's going to do it? For example, it's been 13 weeks of lockdown with movement restrictions for older adults here in Manila. And no one is actually, the fatality is 65% are older people. That's the fact. So I understand the public health concern of restricting the movements of older people given the high fatality rate. But what about concerns related to muscle loss because there's not much movement inside the house, or access to vitamin D, or the fact that there's a mental issue related to isolation? These are things I don't hear it in terms of policy from my government. There's always this blanket policy of lockdowns and movement restrictions, but the implication on the impact of health, where should that leadership come from? I'm always wondering about, since you started this discussion on leadership, I don't hear it here. I'm not sure if I'm doing it correctly in terms of getting the context. I mean, this weekly meeting is the one that makes sense, but other than that, the problem in the local public health is that there seems to be no solution. It's just identifying problem, identifying fatality, and all these things. Thank you. I think I have enough. Let me hear.
What a really important question. We can see the problems, we can feel them, we're really wanting to act on them, but where are the people with whom we can connect in order to make a difference? Well, I know of at least 5 absolutely amazing Filipino public health actors, some in government, some in NGOs, and that's where the connection part matters. So I've got a piece of work to do now. After this call, I don't think I'll do it today, but I'm going to start the process of helping make the connections, because that's the role of people like me. We're catalysts. We're there to help you find the connections, and perhaps one can view the sort of environment we're trying to create here through these kinds of webinars is creating the cradle in which you can share without any kind of fear what it is it's in your mind, and then we can try to work together. So it's not just me offering ideas. If there are others on this webinar who feel that they could help Joseph either to connect with leaders who will work through some of these issues of proper leadership for the rights and well-being, health, mental and physical health of older people, let's help him to get connected. And so we'll do that, Joseph. It's a bit of a project, and we will follow up. And if you would like to be connected with Joseph, please put the relevant stuff in the chat part of the call, And Joseph, I don't know whether we've got a way to connect with you by email or something, but could you make sure we have it in whatever way, either with a private message to Twee or to me? Actually, I don't. Yes, or with an open message. Joseph, thank you, and it's an honour that you join us so regularly. You know, and we are very privileged that you're here and sharing your views with us. Another person who joins us regularly and who I'm just in awe of because I've learned so much from her over the years, and I'm afraid to admit that it's actually quite a long time that Marianne and I have been working together, is Marianne Hasselgrave. Welcome, Marianne, and thank you for coming again. Do you want to speak yourself, or would you prefer that I say your words? Now is the moment if you'd like to. Come in.
Well, if I may, firstly, David, I'm glad you now get this idea of gender and the role that women play. It's taken you a little while, but you're now really on board. And when you look at COVID, it's beyond the terrible problem of gender-based violence. And the more we see, the more you say good things about women, but that's an aside. What is really troubling me is that the whole approach to this is what I call developed country. What was happening in the UK, and we won't go into the details, but we can throw a lot of money at it. We're going to have problems, and OECD has just come out with all these. Our economy is going down the tubes. But with that happening, it's going to cut down the money that UK can put into overseas development, because even if you just work on sums. And what really is concerning me is, how do we look at the issue more from a developing country approach? The problems are different. Okay, we do have problems with migrants here. We don't have slums. We don't have all these problems. And COVID, even if it's dealt with now, it's going to go on. And I know I have a lot of faith in the idea of the 2030 agenda, but I think the whole thing is really going to go off track. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't really have anything else to say because I agree with you. The virus is an extra burden for people in poor countries, poor people everywhere, and they're the ones who've got the least space and opportunity to reduce the threat. So for me, as I've heard before, but I'd say it to you very strongly, there is only one solution, which is to address the features of life, particularly in poor countries, that put people at risk of this disease. And my recent news from India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan in particular, that whole collection of countries in South Asia is just pointing it out to me. And because that's where, as you know, Marianne, I spent 5 years of my working life, I'm super conscious of it. But yeah, it's a global problem, and it's a particular problem for the developing world. And the estimates suggest that the numbers of cases is increasing at an astronomical rate. And the development assistance community, whether it is bilateral development assistance community or the international institutions like the IMF, they are not sufficiently resourced to be able to prevent a huge amount of impoverishment, malnutrition, deprivation, and, just to be explicit about it, further difficulties specifically for women because of the way in which they have to carry so many of the societal burdens. So yeah, and that is right at the top of my agenda. Politically, I am obviously talking regularly to those who do have control over development assistance, saying, don't steal the development assistance just for domestic priorities. It is totally unfair. I won't go into a huge amount of detail because that would not be appropriate right now, but I'll follow up with you afterwards, if you don't mind, on who I'm in contact with. But I'd particularly like to ask the NGO community in, for example, the UK, who are consistently the primary lobbyists on these issues, not to give up. And in that, I'm particularly connected to Danis Iskandarajan, the CEO of Oxfam UK, who is very keen to get stronger mobilization around the way in which COVID is just making poor people and poor communities so much poorer, and going to lead to doubling the number of people in our world who are extremely hungry, and so on. I know that's not an answer, but I just want to say I totally agree with you. Do you want to come back?
Very, very briefly, thank you. We need to talk more about where the entry point is.
Yeah.
The global politicians, through the 2030 agenda, or what's happening at the Security Council, they're still playing political games, and that doesn't work. So perhaps in a future session, David, you can really address this, because the issue for developing countries, I don't think we've even begun to see the impact. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to, I made myself super unpopular in a seminar on public-private actors recently on what's happening on food, Marianne, when I just said at the end, I don't think anybody truly gets the magnitude of what's happening. And I got into really my most serious tone of voice. And afterwards, I got these various notes from people saying, you're going to become really unpopular. And that's because I just couldn't find myself giving out some kind of optimistic message about the situation in so many developing countries right now.
David, I think we have to become unpopular,
Yeah.
if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to say, I've got a comment coming in from Chris Langdon, and then a comment coming in from Annie Feltham. Probably the exchange is a bit shorter now because I've got to give evidence to a parliamentary committee, not the British, another country, later this morning, and I've got to just get my head really into it, and that means I will stop on time. Chris Langdon of Thinking the Unthinkable. Chris, who joined us on many of these, but also who is just not giving up in, as Marianne suggested, in talking about stuff that doesn't feel good. Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David. Good morning. I've got a question in response to your comment to Chris on Tuesday about the Great Reset. Yeah. I have no axe to grind for the Davos man, and it is usually a man. I've been there once, and once was enough. But given the paucity of global leadership and the fact that impressive people like the International TUC is involved, and the organizer has talked about a process involving all, not just elites, it implies, how do we take him at his word? And I ask that, particularly given all you have contacts, I won't name them, with a number of people who are influential at WEF. How do we actually make this into a genuinely useful thing rather than a PR exercise by Davos?
First of all, what Chris is referring to, for those of you who didn't hear the last exchange, is the announcement by the leaders of the World Economic Forum, together with a number of other world leaders, including the head of the International Trades Union Congress, that they are working for something called the Great Reset, which is really to focus on what they call stakeholder capitalism within the context of the fourth industrial revolution, and include equity, respect for nature, and climate action more strongly as development priorities of governments, businesses, civil society, union movements, and so on. And Chris, I see this as something positive, because if these people with power are actually prepared to admit that things need to be different, then that is a really extraordinary thing, because normally you expect people of power just want to go on with the same structures and all the rest. But at the same time, it's what's inside the reset that matters so much. And for me, as I said at the beginning, listening to people who are at the wrong end of power and understanding just how challenging their life choices are, and recognizing that they're not being served, as Joseph said, by policymakers, and that it's sort of really being conscious that they have very little redress when they're laid off work or when services are cut. You know, trying to get in there from the perspective of those who are really having tough lives, for me, is the key. And so, is the Great Reset also the Great Listen? Is it also the great shift in terms of how those with power act? Is it the great inclusion? And is it the great correction, given that, honestly, so much is going wrong? So to make it not just for just nice sounding stuff and people sitting around saying, aren't we good? We're saying we're going to do different, but quietly we'll do the same. You know, there has to be a lot more inside what that reset is. And Chris, let's work together on that. And you will go back to Davos, I'll bet you.
I hope not.
A big wager there. Annie Feltham, you've got, I mean, I know that you struggle with structural change. I know that as a political activist, many years you've been saying to yourself, well, we push and we push and we push, but we don't really shift. And so I want to ask you, Annie, within that context, what do you think? Especially when you put the COVID lens on.
Yeah, right, thanks. Oh, blimey, in a minute and a half. I think there's a challenge between looking at change that systemically we need, and I absolutely get that, and not a lot of people seem to be following us on this systemic, these big questions that we're asking. And then on the other hand, we need to act quickly because COVID is a matter of life and death, and a lot of the things, it pushes that up so clearly. And I find you almost put yourself into a psychotic situation where you're thinking systemically, and that's how you want people to, and I absolutely agree with everything you said about leadership. And then when you work on the ground, the dirty politics of it and the pushbacks that you get, it makes it very hard to sort of even to work out what you are achieving. And then to see, as a small example, our Prime Minister announced yesterday that single elderly could now mix within a bubble of another household to get over the problems that Joseph is talking about, the mental ones. But it didn't come in any sort of systemic analysis of what was going on or any sort of policy initiative. It just sort of dropped out of the air. And so constantly you're trying to get a balance between the practicalities and the systemic stuff, and I sometimes that's really difficult. And yes, absolutely, politics have come right back in it, and so people are being competitive and rather nasty again.
Yeah. No answer, but I'm just looking at who's on this call, and there are many people on this call who are working for systemic change in a value-driven way, but at the same time who are having to cope day to day with pushback, disappointment, frustration, and at the end of the day thinking, I've just gone backwards today. And then the next day, getting up in the morning thinking, is it worth going on? And yet we do go on. And as we reach the end, I'm just going to ask John to comment on what you've just said and anything else he wants to comment on. I just do want to give shout out. Shamim, thank you for being with us. Shamim, you see, he's a political actor in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Sorry, can you ask again?
Yeah. I was just saying, Shamim, I was just giving you a shout out for being a constant political actor in your country and having all the time to fight. And I know how hard you've been fighting. and it goes on, it doesn't stop. And I know that some days you get fed up. You've got fed up with me sometimes, so I know that. And but you keep going. And I just wanted to, in a way, shout out to one or two other people who are here before John takes over, just to say, I think it's why we need to just hold together, because it is tough work, this, and just thank you. And my brother William's here. William, did you just want to just say hello to everybody? Because I think you just wrote something in the chat. I just at least want to greet you. Or perhaps you got your video off.
No, I will say hello and hello to everybody. Thank you, David.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so John, reflections on what you've heard, and if anybody else in the team would like to make a reflection, please unmute yourself. Please show me a video or send me a message. John.
Thank you, David. It's always fascinating for me listening to this conversation go, at one moment scribbling notes to send to Catherine or sometimes Florence, who's next to you, and another time trying to stay locked into it. And the thing that struck me today is that we're in such a fluid time. Things are shifting very, very rapidly. And at such moments, people try to capture them in terms of, is it a reset? Is it a fourth industrial revolution or a fifth or whatever? And I think that's fine. But what really matters goes to perhaps what's behind the conversation we had earlier about evaluation. And that is, can we learn really, really quickly about what's going on by getting very close to people who are experiencing the reality of things rather than sitting in the Davos man bubble, if you like, by paying attention to what people are telling us, by seeing how that fits to broader patterns, and by using that to try and change, if only slightly, the things that we've always done. Otherwise, we don't get a reset. We just return to where we've been before. So the big thing that comes through from me in this is, how do we rapidly learn about what this virus is telling us and use that to try to experiment with doing things different so that we evolve to much better ways of doing things. That's me, David.
Thank you, John. John is every day offering me and others in the team that kind of reflection. And it's so helpful. Just what is, just helping me to slightly shift the way in which I look at the problem and then find a way through. Does anyone else in the team, and I include here William, who's working with us now, want to make a last comment just before we close? Then I'm going to jump on one person, and he won't be expecting it. Paul Garner. Paul Garner's been somebody that we've been working with now for many years, and is particularly coming close. What have you felt listening to today's discussion, Paul?
I'm hopeful that we hold the changes and the vision that we see in this current madness. It's like being in a bad dream for some of us, and we can see all the opportunities for the future, but sometimes with dreams, you forget the lessons that you've learned at the time and you don't take them forward in the future. So the value of a group like this is for us collectively to hold that and move forward with all these important changes and pushes that we see as we move forward. That's my reflection.
Thank you, Paul. And do that with care with Paul. I think he's had a really bad COVID, and he's written about it. I think some of you know. And because of his writing and his willingness to write, now his observations are being picked up and are spreading far and wide. The point that Paul makes is this is not a trivial illness. For some people, this is a really horrible, debilitating illness. And Paul, people have been writing saying that they're with us, but I wanted just to say we're with you, just as we're with others for whom COVID has been just so nasty. And I hope from the bottom of my heart that you're getting better. Paul is a professor at of International Public Health at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, part of Liverpool University Group, and is a real public health leader. So thank you, Paul, and thank you for being with us. I know that actually being able to do even an hour of a webinar is quite a challenge for you. So just to continue as we sign off to say, we are with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody, bye-bye. We're doing this again next week. Thank you again, and keep thinking and reflecting and share back. And to my daughter Polly, who's somewhere, there you are, there is Isaac. And just some of you know that Isaac's got a new cousin called Max, who was born 2 days ago. And we've got the most beautiful video of Max's brother, Ori, meeting Max. And now Isaac has also met Max. And so there is a lot of fun and games going on. Thank you, Polly, for joining us, as always. Wonderful to see you. And with that, that's it. I saw Tracy. Thank you, Tracy, for being with us. I hope you found it helpful. Sarah, thanks for being with us. It's just lovely to be connected again. And everybody else, stay in touch and connect. See you next week. Annabelle, good to see you as well. I just saw you at the bottom. Bye-bye. Thanks to the team, always. Thanks to the team. Big thanks. Shamim, stay strong. Mudaka Maoti. I will come. As soon as we can travel, I want to come back and see you. When travel is possible, I will come back to Dhaka.
Yeah, I just sent a request to you that we are planning to have a webinar on the nutrition in developing countries, especially focus on the urban areas. If you can join with us, if it's fit with your schedule, so let me know. I like to engage you.
Okay. I just want to say hello to my daughter Josephine, who I see, I think she's at work, but you're at work, wearing a mask, and listening to us on her Bluetooth headphones. Josie, thank you for joining us, and thanks also for all you're doing to try to help small and medium enterprises stay afloat, because that's important work. It's a really important contribution. And to Isaac Fawcett. Have a nice day, Isaac. Bye.